When I am down and oh, my soul so weary, when troubles come and my heart burden be, then I am still and wait here in the silence until you come and sit a while with me. You raise me up so I can stand on mountains. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I am on your shoulder. You raise me up to more than I can be. There is no life without its hunger. Each restless heart beats so imperfectly. But when you come and I am filled with wonder, sometimes I think I glimpse eternity. You raise me up so I can stand on mountains. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I'm on your shoulders. You raise me up to more than I can be. You raise me up so I can stand on mountains. You raise me up to dance on stormy seas. I am strong when I am on your shoulders. You raise me up to more than I can be. You raise me up so I can stand on mountains. You raise me up to walk on stormy seas. I am strong when I'm up on your shoulder. You raise me up to more than I can be. You raise me up to more than I can be.
Why do I have to follow that?
No pressure.
Thank you, sir. That was beautiful. Two things. Three things. Doug was right. I spent some time on this yesterday. One thing when Deb was reading the gospel lesson that came to mind, see if you relate to this. Of course, Jesus mentioned and washed the disciples' feet because, honestly, how many of you wash your feet in the shower, right? So it's the last things. That's why Peter was already clean except for his feet. So that stuck out with me yesterday. But here's the real point. When we celebrate every Sunday morning, the readings kind of connect, right? Have you guys made a connection yet between the hats and Jesus washing the feet? Have you done that? You have no clue, right? Okay, I'm going to help you with that. At least that's my goal, is to help you with that. But we're going to get there. So It's pretty interesting. Did you see the hats up here? These were hats loaned to us. There might be one missing before the day is over. If they match my socks. From Letitia's grandmother, so again, thank her for us. But before we begin, pray with me, please, that we may be lifted up together as community that is pleasing to God. So may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be lifted up to meet you, God, and may they be pleasing to you, because you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So the contemporary reading was from the book Crowns, Portraits of Black Women in Church Hats. And we have the picture here of Jeanette Lewis. We have some hats here from Letitia's grandmother, some really beautiful hats. So Reverend Lilly had said to me, hey, listen, take a look at the book. So the book is a series of 50 black and white photographs. And that's the only downside of the book. If the pictures were in color, these hats would just pop. You would be able to see the color. The styles are beautiful. And for me, if I had been able to see the color, they would have been even more vibrant. But at the same time, though, they did pop in my imagination. Maybe that was the author's purpose, was to make me look at them in a different view. So they're complemented by interviews, and Mary Lee had read one of the interviews. They explore the roles of the church hat as a reflection of both personal style and a cherished African-American tradition. The book is simply about 50 black women in their hats. That's the book. So on the front cover, front flap of the book, it says this: countless black women would rather attend church naked than hatless. For these women, a church hat, flamboyant as it may be, is no mere fashion accessory. It's a cherished African-American custom, one observed with boundless passion by black women of various religious denominations. A woman's hat speaks long before its wearer utters a word. It's what Deirdre Guyon calls hatitude. And I love this line. There's a little more strut in your carriage when you wear a nice hat. There's something special about you. If a hat says a lot about a person, it says even more about a people. The customs they observe, the symbols they prize, and the fashions they fancy. On the back cover of Women in Their Church Hats, here's a few quotes. You're gonna love these. We just know inside that we're queens, not you guys. And these are the crowns we wear, says Felicia McMillan, who's a journalist. Next quote. Listen, never touch my hat. Admire it from a distance. Amen. Those are the Hat Queen rules, honey. Peggy Knox, child care provider. You can flirt with a fan in your hand. You can flirt holding a cigarette too. But a woman can really flirt with a hat. Dolores Foster, real estate agent. Here's one. My husband said, you don't need another hat. You don't have but one head. Dorothy Winecroft, middle school teacher, retired. So I told you those when I wrote them down before I read the book. I thought that would be a good way to get a laugh, right? And then I looked at the book, and then I read some history about what this really meant, how it connects to the gospel reading, and how it connects to lifting people up, the tie that binds. And I realized that this is about something more profound than getting a laugh on these quotes. There's something wonderful and spiritual about all of this. So hats became a symbol for African American women that they had arrived, that they had made it in some small way. Huge for them. As a part of the African American community, they suffered under the tyranny of slavery, right? For a black woman to be able to buy a hat, it was no easy task. It wasn't something simple. They just went to the store and bought a hat. So when they bought the hat, they made sure everybody noticed. Hence the style, the ornate look, the beauty of the hat, the netting, the colors, the ribbons, everything you see up here with these 4 hats. And I believe every time they did that, God smiled each and every time. That's what I believe after I looked at that book last night. It's also true that black women who were fortunate enough to wear hats, here it is, often gave some of the hats to other black women who could not afford to buy a hat. And why did they do that? because this was their way of lifting up another. Right? You see the connection now?
Amen.
It was a symbol of worthiness and honor. Here's this quote from the book. Our crowns have already been bought and paid for. All we have to do is wear them. Right? So the hats were passed on to lift up one another, to lift up those less fortunate that maybe did not have the ability yet to believe in themselves, to walk into that church and feel honored and uplifted. A way to lift up the other is what this was all about. So it's not only a cultural tradition, but a spiritual one that symbolizes triumph over hardship. For these women, faith and fashion really became one. There's a woman of God underneath each and every one of these hats. That's a very important piece of this. So even when society told them otherwise, they knew what they were doing, and they knew that God smiled upon them. So did you know that slave owners shaved the heads of every black woman to show dominance over them, to strip them of their individuality, right? But even on the plantations, all those hundreds of years ago, these women wore headdresses to distinguish themselves. Maybe the beginning of this hat piece, right? Even then, they made sure that they could distinguish themselves as women of God and as individuals with self-worth, even with everything they had to endure back in those days. So take another look at these hats. Either now, during the service, after the service, come up and take a look. See them from a whole different perspective now. I think you can. When you first came in, you saw them up here, you're thinking, what's going on? What are those hats there for? Are we auctioning them off? I'm just kidding, we're not auctioning them off. Right? Now think about, from what I just said, think about what these hats represent now, right? They tell a story. And they helped lift up Letitia's grandmother, and I'm sure she in turn used some of them to lift up other women along her personal journey. I'm sure of it. And I don't know Letitia's grandmother, but I know the history now, and I know Letitia. So we thank God for that, and we thank your grandmother for all that she's done. So that's the connection to today's gospel lesson, where Jesus washed the disciples' feet. It was his way of saying that I have been lifted up, and I want to pass the lifting along to you by washing your feet. So therein lies the connection between the two readings today. He wanted them to remember how lifting works. We are always lifted for the good, right? Remember that. We're always lifted for the good. To do good, to lift, and not to tear someone down. We never lift to tear someone down. Sometimes we confuse that. We want to lift someone up to make them think we're doing something good, but we have an ulterior motive. Let's do away with that. We always lift for the good. So I want to go over 3 points like Reverend Terry did last week, a 3-point sermon, so I can stay on topic and not stray and keep you here until 12:30, 1 o'clock. Point 1, lifting requires humility. So what does that mean? Jesus said, as you heard, I am not concerned with hygiene, but holiness. So it seems that he was trying to tell Peter that what he was doing didn't have anything to do with how he looked, but how clean he was. It had to do with holiness, actually. You simply can't share what is holy without humility. Do you believe that?
Amen.
So throughout the Gospels, think of all the stories of the religious leaders of the day. The Pharisees, all the traps they tried to set for Jesus, trying to get him to heal on the Sabbath, all of those things. And if you remember, if you watch a movie from back in the day, anything about Jesus, they were always very holy looking, always dressed holy. But think about all that. Think about the stories in the gospel, the pictures, all that holiness. Can you recall any humility to that? I don't think so. There was never any humility to that holiness. And if there's no humility to the holiness, then there is no lifting up. They weren't trying to lift Jesus up. And if they were trying to lift him up to tear him down. Plain and simple. So those folks did not lift anyone up. So lifting others up is a holy act. It's always a holy act. It's not about how it looks. It's not about getting credit for doing it. It's not about keeping score, and it's definitely not about yelling out, hey, look what I did for so-and-so. It's not about that, because if you do that, then there is no humility to your holiness. Lifting is a moment when I remember the times I've been lifted up and in turn lift someone else up. That's a key piece of this. Sometimes we come to church, and Reverend Lilly has talked about this numerous times, and there's a moment in the service, or there's something that's changed in the service, and one of you might be happening right now during my sermon where you go, ugh. he's preaching again. Where you go, ugh, and it's just not your moment, right? It's not your moment. But here's what happens when we're in community with humble hearts, with humility, is when it's our opportunity to there's someone else that goes, I love that moment. So we then have to lift that person up. Not the one that went, their time's coming in a moment, but the person that's having a wonderful moment, we lift them up. And why do we lift them up? Why do we lift them up? We lift that person up so that their experience of God's love can be brought up to even a greater depth of love. That's our moment to lift that person up. Because inevitably, there's going to come a moment in the same service where that person that was just lifted up is going to go, ugh, about another moment. And the person that went, before is going to go, I love this moment. So then it happens all over again. And then we lift that person up to experience God's love at a greater depth. That's what lifting one another up is all about. It happens here in this community. And if we do it right here, then we can take it through those double doors and do it out there. Because that's really our call for the other, to build relationships outside of these walls. Amen. If we just do it here, it's a good thing, but is that really our call? Is that what Jesus calls us to do when we lift up others? We need to decide to lift in the moment with humility, know what's happening in love, and always, always celebrate it. Always. Point 2, lifting is for everyone. Even though Jesus had a few people around him who he knew would betray him, he still washed their feet, didn't he? And why? Why would he do that? I'll tell you why. Because Jesus spent his life breaking down social norms, living at the margins, lifting up the poor, the outcast, the sick, and the dying. And if Jesus were to draw a line and put the people in society that society rejects on one side of the line, you know what would happen? We would always find Jesus on that side every single time. Every time we would find Jesus on that side. Every time without exception. Do you agree? Yes. Every time. And that's why Jesus washed the feet of those that he knew would betray him. Because that's what Jesus does. And that's what Jesus expects from each and every one of us. Is it easy? No. Loving God isn't easy all the time. Loving one another is even harder. Liking one another is even harder than loving one another. Which is why I always have said, thank goodness, thank God, thank Jesus that Jesus said, love one another. Because if he said like one another, we'd all be in trouble. Right? That's what I think anyway. So Jesus gave them a lift by washing their feet. Even those that may not have deserved it, Jesus was constantly lifting people up, not just in his ministry, but I believe in his entire life. We don't know much about the first 30 years. We have a little bit about when he was 12, a couple verses, chapters here and there, and then from 30 to 33, but not much about the rest of his life. But I have to believe that he was constantly lifting people up. Treating them as equals all the time, regardless of their social standing. There were people treated as less than equal, even at times as less than human, by the Roman Empire, by the religious leaders of the time, but not Jesus. He got down on his hands and knees to wash the feet of his friends. Think about that. He became the servant once again so that he can lift them up. It's easy to tell ourselves that we should only give a lift to those who deserve it, right? You deserve it, so I'm going to lift you up. Those who are self-made. This is where that old phrase, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, comes from. Which, by the way, is actually physically impossible. And don't ask me how I know that. It took about an hour last night. It doesn't work. The false assumption we sometimes make is that we think we get to decide who is worthy. We think we get to decide that. Like those who pull themselves up in a way that we think is deserving, then we give them a lift. Because they worked on it themselves, so we give them a lift. But what's really our effort when we do that? But what about those who clearly don't deserve it? How do we put ourselves in a position to give them a lift anyway? How do we do that? So, when I was a young college/seminarian student, when I was 21 years old, and I spent a year in Rome, thank you. Thank you very much. So my second year, first year, I had a spiritual director in Connecticut in the seminary who was transferred to the North American College of Rome, which is the theology school that sat behind the Vatican. So I would go visit him once or twice a week, and I would walk down the main road that led to St. Peter's Basilica called the Via della Conciliazione, which is a road of conciliation. This is St. Peter's Basilica, right? Wonderful, beautiful building. And on each side of that road sat all the beggars, all the homeless. I'd go by, 21-year-old kid, very idealistic. I visited all 4 of the Catholic museums and saw all the artwork inside the St. Peter's Basilica. And I'd get to see my spiritual director, and I would yell and scream about if the Catholic Church sold all their artwork, we'd feed the entire world. So I was that idealistic kid. But as I walked by, I would always throw a few coins in this one container for this one young girl. Looked like maybe she was 13 or 14, had a baby wrapped in her arms. And once in a while, I would try to reach down just to kind of touch the baby and say hello, and she would always pull back, and I thought she was just afraid. And after about a month or two, I went and I put the coins in. The coins popped out, so I went to pull up the coins. She went to grab the coins, and she moved, and the baby kind of came towards me, and I went to touch the baby, and I touched the baby, and the baby was plastic. So it was a doll. So I got angry. I was 21 years old. I don't know if I get angry today. You might get a little disturbed. So I got angry. So what I did, I took my coins back. Hey, I was 21. I was on a budget. I took my coins back. She was embarrassed. And I went to see my spiritual director, and I explained what happened, and he just, in his way, just nodded and asked me. We won't get through all that. But so I was angry about this. And I asked myself the next couple of months why I was angry. I felt taken. I felt embarrassed. I didn't think about the other, anything about relationships. None of that was going through my mind at that time. So about a month later, after passing her and looking the other way, right, I took out it wasn't a dollar, I took out a bill, Italian money, and I went to go put it in her thing. And she reached for it, and she stood up, and she started to walk across the street, and she went like this for me to follow her. So I followed her across the street. And sitting across the street all by herself was this elderly woman, just sitting by herself. Now, elderly, she was probably 45 or 50. I was 21. And she handed her the bill. This woman was homeless, really homeless. And she looked at me, We didn't speak any words, but what that told me was she was giving the money to someone that needed it. Because back then, it's probably still happening now, there are groups, there are gypsies, there are groups that do this for a living, right? They prey on tourists and things like that, and then they drive away in their expensive cars. I've seen that in Rome. But something happened there to her. Did I lift her up? Did she lift me up? So I thought about this shit. This came to me yesterday. I haven't thought about this story in 30 years. But this came to me yesterday. So this is an example of being lifted up without even knowing they're being lifted up. Because she had some sort of moment where she realized that she needed to do something different. Now, I have no idea what happened to this young girl. I know the baby didn't grow up. But it did something to me for the rest of my time there, and then for the rest of my life. I started to see things differently. I really did. It didn't matter to me what was really going on with these folks. I just gave. I thought it was the right thing to do. And what happened after that wasn't any of my business. So that's how I handled that, because I felt lifted up. Didn't call it that at the time, but that's how I felt. So we need to think of the other. Remember, capital O, right? The other. More than ourselves, or at least at the very least, as much as ourselves. Remember when Jesus washed the feet of his friends, he lifted them up to a higher place, which is really another example of radical hospitality. Remember that series? Remember Reverend Lily teaching about radical hospitality? Welcoming the stranger, accepting the other, building relationships. This all ties together. So what did Jesus say when he got up from washing the feet of his disciples in today's gospel lesson? He said, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You address me as teacher and master, and rightly so. That is what I am. So if I, the master and teacher, wash your feet, you must now wash each other's feet. I've laid down a pattern for you. I've laid down a pattern for you. What I've done, you do." So Jesus tells us to go and do likewise. To go and do likewise. Does not mean you stop on Main Street in Sarasota and say, "Hey, can I wash your feet?" It doesn't mean that, right? I'm being silly. It means lift someone up. And not because they deserve it, right? Because that's the easy way. Number 3, lifting begets lifting. Begets, that's a word you use every day, right? But begat, to have created or formed something new. So lifting can create or form new lifting. See what I did there? Okay. So how can you lift another if you have not been lifted yourself? Jesus said, "This is the pattern I have set for you." Jesus lifts us, and then we lift others. Simple. Jesus came down and became fully human so that he could live with us in relationship, in unity, right in the midst of community. That's where Jesus resides, in the midst of community. All of us have been lifted somewhere along the way, right? Would you agree? Yes. Okay. Either by a parent, a teacher, by a friend or a stranger, and most of all, by God. So, I try to think of something personal when I was lifted. So I'm going to share a story with you I've never shared publicly before, ever. Brian knows it from many years ago. I'll be quick. So I don't share it publicly because it's a story that people question and they think I'm a little crazy. So, well, so you think that anyway. So I'm going to share with you a dream. Cheryl? So, in 1993, I was one month before my son's first birthday. I was diagnosed with a liver disease, I had hepatitis B, and it got worse and it got worse, became chronic. I was not one of those people that healed on their own. It continued to get worse, and the drug at the time, the only drug for hepatitis B, did not work. So in 1993, I was told that I had 3 years to live. So I ended up hooking up with the National Institutes of Health in Bethesda, and they put me on experimental drugs, and it would work and then fail, and the next drug would work and it would fail, and it went through, a dozen different drugs. And it was pretty trying for my family, for myself, and thinking that I wouldn't see my son grow up, and all those things that go along with having a life-threatening illness. So, and I had a cousin who died when Nick was when my son was 6 months old. She was 25. She was accidentally shot in the head by her boyfriend, accidentally. And so, 2.5 years into my 3-year sentence, I had a dream that I was sitting, bless you, that I was sitting in a car in front of my grandparents' house, which is strange, and I was about to drive down the road, and it was raining, and then the skies opened up, and it was a torrential downpour, kind of like the kind we have here where you can't see anything, you know the one I'm talking about? And I was deathly afraid. I was deathly afraid that something would happen to me. See the correlation there? And didn't want to go forward, did not want to go forward. So next thing I know, I turn my head a bit, and sitting up on the back seat. You know how people in the back seat kind of sit up because they want to hear what's going on in the front seat? And it's my cousin, Paula, who had passed away 6 months earlier. And she smiled at me, and I smiled at her. No idea why she was in my dream. I hadn't thought about her for a while, and I said, I don't want to drive. It's too scary. And she said, just go forward. So I started to drive, and the windshield wipers were at full blast, and I still couldn't see. She said, just go forward. So I'm going forward, and I said, I don't want to do this. And she said, it's going to be okay. Just go forward. So I kept going forward. I looked at her, I said, I don't want to do this. And she said, everything's going to be fine. And I got towards the end of the road, which was the bottom of the hill, and the rain stopped, and the sun came out, the blinding sun, and I woke up. So why do I tell you that story in this sermon? I tell you this because when I thought about this last night, I haven't thought about that dream in many, many years, I feel that was God. I always felt that was God lifting me up, saying, don't be afraid. Because here's what happened after that dream. I wasn't afraid. In every doctor's visit I went to in Bethesda, Maryland, every diagnosis I was given, I just shrugged it off because I knew I'd be okay. I got diagnoses about, hey, there's lesions on your liver, they're cancerous, sorry. And I would go, okay, see you next week. And it turned out that wasn't really the diagnosis, it was something else. And that went on for a number of years, and in 2002, the virus seroconverted, it was gone. Don't know why, doctors don't even know why. So, that was my moment of being lifted up by God. That's my God moment, my God wink. That's what happened. So that's what I wanted to share with you as far as that moment. So when was the last time you were lifted by God? I know you have a story. You don't have to share it now, but think about it. Think about it when you're driving home today. Remember something good. Remember something that touched your heart. When did you need something or someone that came along and gave you a lift unexpectedly? When was the last time you asked God for a lift and then went, whoa, when you got it? That still happens, right? Or how about those God winks I just talked about, those God moments, those little lifts we forget to notice that we get every single day. They're tiny, but we still get them. But we're too busy to pay attention to them. You know what a coincidence is, right? It's God's way of remaining anonymous. You've heard that before? Don't forget that either. We must look out for them, see when they happen. Why? Because it's pretty hard to give what you don't have. So you can't lift someone else up if you don't feel you're getting lifted yourself. So I know we say it's a small world, isn't it? We say that phrase like, it's a small world. But really, it isn't. People are being beaten down in the world, in our country, in our neighborhoods. God needs us. God needs us to help lift each other up. Being lifted is a tie that we want to bind ever so tight, but not to choke or restrict, but to stay connected in relationship, in community with one another, with the other, and of course with God. So I say, Harabe, let's pull together. Amen.
Amen.